And the identity that you have is all of that stretching from lowest to highest at once. And having understood that, you now understand something else. You understand what actually constitutes genuine human flourishing at the psychological level. So one of the disservices that clinicians have offered the general Western world and the world at large as a consequence of that is the notion that mental health is somehow something subjective. And that's not true, and we know it's not true even though we don't know that we know it. And you know that because there's no way you're going to be mentally healthy if your wife is miserable. First of all, she won't let you be. And the same thing applies to your children. One of my neighbors in Toronto said to me once, a mother is never any happier than her most miserable child, right? And so you can see in that whatever mental health constitutes, it's not exactly mental, and it's certainly not merely subjective. It's something that's much more like the harmony that exists when the entire subsidiary structure is performing all of its functions as they should be performed. Now, Samuel Andreev, just before me, talked about what music speaks to us, and that's what music speaks to us. It speaks to us of the harmony that can exist in a complex structure that's laid out in a properly subsidiary manner, where each note serves the phrase, and each phrase serves the melody, and each person who's playing in the orchestra serves the overarching function of the music, and the music is the eternal dance between chaos and order. And that speaks to us of meaning because that's where meaning is to be found. And that's the other thing to understand about a subsidiary organization. You know, we have so many people in the world who are lost in ways that are almost unimaginable with their absolutely fragmented identities, and they have no meaning in their life. And they have no meaning in their life because, strangely enough, the meaning in your life doesn't emerge as a consequence of your pursuit of your proximal, hedonic, subjective, narrow, purely self-serving goals and drives. There's nothing in that that's nourishing, and there's nothing in that that's nourishing in part because unless you can integrate yourself across a large time span, taking care of who you will be in the future and simultaneously fulfilling your social obligations in a responsible manner, nothing within the subsidiary structure can operate properly, much less you claim the right to the gratification of your hedonic desires. That's a non-starter. And even if you could do that, you wouldn't find in that the meaning that would sustain you in times of trouble. You find the meaning that, and everyone knows this, you find the meaning that sustains you in trouble when you need, for example, to regard yourself with some positive attitude in the midst of your stupidity and your suffering, and you can see in yourself the fact that, well, at least you were in service to your wife, at least you had been useful to your children, at least you helped take care of your parents, at least you were of some service to your friends or to your customers, to your business associates, to your nation. You find that meaning in service, and that service is in service of that harmony that makes up the entire Jacob's ladder that stretches from earth to heaven, and it's always been that way. And we offer our children thin gruel as a replacement for that magnificent version of multidimensional harmony, responsibility, and beauty. And there's more to it than that too. You know, I read the book, the biblical book that details out the life of Abraham, and I mentioned this when the conference opened. And Abraham begins his life with all his proximal hedonic needs satiated. And the voice of God comes to him and says, go out into the world, get away from what's merely infantile and satiating, and have the adventure of your life. And that's a good bargain because we're built not for mere proximal infantile satiation of our base desires, but to move out into the world like the adventurers that we are, and to face the complexities of the catastrophic future with a certain degree of nobility and courage, and to hoist the world on our shoulders and to struggle uphill. And it's in that struggle that the meaning of life emerges. If you lived your life completely, maybe it would justify itself, right? If you could, and where would you find the meaning that justifies the suffering in life? And the answer to that is, well, you find it in the burden burden of responsibility. Because the burden of responsibility isn't a burden. It's the greatest opportunity you could possibly have. And you know perfectly well when you're trying to decide if your own life is worth having, that if someone comes up to you even once and says, you know, what you did for me, it really mattered. And that might get you through like a week of rough times. Just the mere fact that it was obvious that the sacrifices that you made in relationship to others actually made a difference. And you can make a continual difference in your life if you adopt the proper sacrificial attitude, right? And it's the sacrificial attitude that makes the hierarchy of identity possible, because what you do with the proper sacrifice is continually sacrifice the lower to the higher. You sacrifice your own self-serving, proximal, hedonic whims to a pattern of being that sustains you across the long run and that unites more and more people. And it's a worthwhile sacrifice because the payback for the sacrifice overwhelmingly, what would you say, is overwhelmingly disproportionate to the cost. And everyone who's had a child who has any sense, who's escaped from their primordial narcissism, understands this, because bringing a child into the world and watching that person develop is a bittersweet adventure, because children are fragile and things go wrong, but it's a very rare person whose head is set on their shoulders in anything approximating the proper manner who isn't thrilled to death to see the person they brought into the world thrive as a consequence of their sacrifices, and to see in that thriving the justification for all the pain that was associated with their production. And that's what life is like, and we don't let young people know this anymore. You know, here's something psychologists discovered in the last 20 years. There is no technical difference between thinking about yourself and being miserable. Those are the same thing. And you know that too. You know, if I'm on stage and I'm talking to you, and all of a sudden I become self-conscious, I drown in anxiety and I lose my place. Right? And that's what's happening to the young people that we see who are adrift. They're taught to be nothing but self-conscious, to do nothing but think about their immediate needs, to refer to themselves as the locus of all things, and there's nothing you could do that would make them more miserable. It's identical with the instruction in misery. And you want to be outside yourself, serving a higher purpose, and maybe you're cynical about that, but you can think about it technically. Well, why do you bring a fork to the table? Well, so that you can put a plate beside it. And why do you put a plate at the table? And it's so that you can set the table to serve your family, to share food, to bring together the people you love in something approximating harmony as a microcosm of the entire cosmic order. And you can replicate that at every level of complexity, all the way up to what's at the pinnacle. And that's all real. And so is what's at the pinnacle.